The ground. It felt loose and shifty underneath his form as he slowly came to firm, but with a lot of give with it as well. As his hearing grew sharper and less muffled, the sounds of the ocean waves lapping against a beach started to become clear. Slowly opening his eyes, he realized he was face down on a sandy beach. And as he groggily pushed himself up and began to look around, he had an immediate shield of his eyes, because his eyes was so used to the dark that the sunlight stunned and temporarily blinded him. Peering cautiously through the slowly opening eyelids, he surveyed his surroundings as his vision slowly adjusted to the intense light. He sat upon a beach completely devoid of other people. As he got to his feet and shaded his eyes, peering out to the shore, he could see no land from any direction on the horizon. He was marooned, lost, trapped in the middle of who knew. His first thought was to panic, but he knew deep down that this would accomplish nothing. In every survival situation that he had ever read had taught him that to keep his cool would be the most important thing right now. Panicking would simply waste precious time and energy. He had to enter and find a way out of this, or find a way to sustain himself while he was here. His first thought was to take his backpack off and get his supplies out, which is when he realized that it was no longer on his back. He looked around for it, wondering if he had washed up on the beach someplace close by. There was no sign of his bag. Everything he had was gone. Okay, so much for that. Time for Plan B, he thought to himself. And that is to come up with a Plan B. He turned away from the shore and surveyed the island. It was vast, with him unable to see the end of it on either side, with a jetty sticking out of the water on his left, and the shore growing craggier towards his right. Straight ahead, about a quarter mile up there was a huge expanse of dense foliage. The trees jutting up from the ground, making it so he could not see what was past them. Thinking to himself, for a moment he turned and walked a few paces back, scooping up handfuls of wet hand and bringing them back to the drier part of the shore and setting them down on the ground before going back and forth a few times, each time carrying wet sand with him. As soon as he felt like he had enough, he arranged it into an indiscriminate shape, one that he did not have too much thought into, but definitely did not look like it formed by itself. He wanted to make some sort of marking to remember that this was where he had landed. He began to walk towards the woods, but stopped when he realized that the insides of his shoes still felt quite wet from when he was in the ocean. He could not afford to let his feet blister out there, so he took off his shoes and laid both of them and his socks out to dry in the warm sun. He sat down on the shore for a moment, looking out at the sea before him, expansive, stretching all the way to the horizon. He gave a wistful sigh as everything he had left behind ran through his mind. His mother, his friends, his entire life. Really, he told himself as he sat there in isolation, it's only for a while, just until he clears his name. Someday soon, everything will be back to normal. He repeated the same thing to himself out loud 3 more times. He had to really feel like it would be okay. It was the only thing that was keeping him from having a breakdown right there on the beach. But not only had he run away, he was completely lost too. Things looked pretty bleak for him. And suddenly, he felt something bump against his leg. That startled. He immediately pushed himself up, feeling backwards once again, looking at what had just brushed up against him. He looked just in time to see something skittering towards the water, vanishing amongst the waves. He didn't get a very good look at it, but the only glance he was afforded, it appeared to be some sort of crab, but it didn't look like any sort of crab he had ever seen before. Its top half and claws were orange, but its bottom half was of only white, and it had 2 sharp-looking protubernacias. I'm assuming those are what claws are, but a more fancier word to say it, that was jutted up from its body. Or was that its head? He also noticed that it kept its claw raised higher than a typical crab. A shame, since it just ran off and he would have liked to study it a bit more. It wasn't like any crustacean he had ever seen. Scratching his head, he turned side to side, scanning the beach for signs of any other strange crabs or anything else he could see. Fortunately, he saw nothing. He got to his feet again and decided that it was time to actually do something about his current predicament. The mysterious crab's arrival was a welcome distraction from the depressing thoughts that had begun to cloud his mind. He turned and began to walk towards the vast thickness of foliage in the distance. He needed to find water and, less important but still important, food. And where there was plant life, there was water. Knowing he would have to tread cautiously if he was to continue without his shoes. He looked down on the ground, seeking out the smoothness, the soft-looking spots to step before he entered the forest. Warily stepping forward, bit by bit, became careful to take a look around ever so often and gently pushing low-hanging branches and leaves aside as he came cautiously through. And it was only just in time that he looked down and saw something big and sharp underneath it, his foot. Startled once again, he yanked his leg up, losing his balance and falling backwards. The thing he was about to step on fled, beginning to climb up a tree and disappear among its branches. But this time, he got a much better look at it. It was some kind of worm or larvae, sort of deep yellow in color, and it appeared as if its body was made up, pushed together, connecting circular segments. Its feet, a soft pink. It had a bit stranger upon its head, and another attached to its tail. Samuel had no idea if it was poisonous or not. If he had stepped on it, he could have very bad consequences for himself. But just before it disappeared before sight, he got a look of its face, and his jaw dropped. This worm thing had black eyes and a nose, a big ovular pink nose. What kind of worm was this exactly? This was like any other of anything he had ever seen or studied or heard of. It had to be a new species of some sort. But he took a deep breath, controlling his excitement. He had to get himself situated here first if he hoped to make it. And he couldn't spend precious time climbing trees, looking for bugs with big pink noses, even though he wanted to, since he loved bugs so much. But it was time to continue onward, a little more cautiously this time though. Eventually, after roughly 15 minutes of trekking through uneven ground, covered in twigs and rocks, he decided that he could no longer go bare feet. Stopped underneath the shade of a taller tree with thick, broad leaves, he searched the ground for something suitable. Sticks gathered about 15 of the small brown dry things. He then looked around for one of the thick vine heavy bushes that he had passed on the way here. He did not have to look very long. Grabbing a length of the thin green vine, he measured out how much he would need to bind the sticks together, and everything he would need. Before he bit it off with his teeth, swishing saliva and spitting it afterwards in case that there was some type of small poison within the vines of the plant. He repeated this process 5 more times before he sat down and began to work. First, he divided the vine segments into 2 sets of 3 before beginning to weave each individual set together to turn them into strong sort of makeshift string. Using the vine bunches to bind half of the sticks together, he slightly thanked his mother for the survival camp lessons as he tied the appropriate knot, and the vines together were sturdy enough to finally handle it. It took him about 20 minutes, but finally he had a makeshift pair of sandals. He stood up, slipping them on, and while they were not very comfortable, they would at least protect his feet so that he could continue on, continuing to trek through the almost jungle-like woods. He finally was able to see the edge of something else, a sort of clearing. Heart hammering, he had made his way toward it fast, as he thought his flimsy sandals would allow without breaking, and soon as he was glad he did so. Beyond the edge of the woods, there was a hard ground covered in smooth stones, some of which were round and some were flat, with the round ones being roughly the size of baseballs. They paved the way to what looked like a smaller canyon up ahead, whose depths twisted right. Figured that to find his way back to the beach again, he would simply need to just turn around. He continued onward, walking towards the canyon, with the sun once again shining down on him. Now that he had left the shade of the trees, As he entered the canyon, its tall walls shut up on either side of him, making him feel ominously closed in. He glanced from the side to the side as he continued on and noticed the smoothness of the canyon walls, the way the rock that made up their form seemed to have strips of cool, natural color in certain spots. Breathing up the slate gray that made up the rest of it, as he saw one strip that was of cool blue. The sight reminded him of water, which reminded him of how thirsty he really was. He tried not to think about it, as most hikers in mountains, climbers already knew what to think about. And water, when he had none to drink, at this point, would only make him panic. He followed the canyon's twisting bend rightwards, taking one last look back at the woods before they disappeared from his view. He turned to face forward again, as it dawned on him that he was in what could be, very well be, 100% unknown territory. It was another hour and a half worth of walking, with a couple of breaks in between, before he heard something, the sound of running water. Hurrying forward as fast as he could, he particularly fell to his knees next to the small streams that he found, which had carved its own path through the canyon walls, running perpendicular right through the stone barrier. He reached down, his hands moving rocks around to make a crude sort of gypsy well, letting some of the water run into it before he cupped it, his hands to scoop a handful up and drinking it down gratefully. This would be easy to come back to as well. All he would need to do is follow the canyon backwards. After he had his hand full, he stood up and began to continue onward. Before he stopped, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a rounded plant, about the size in shape of a cabbage. Wondering if he could eat it, or at least inspect it, he wandered over, letting his curiosity get the better of him, reaching down to pick up the plant. The second his fingers made contact with it, it suddenly jumped and tackled him square in the chest, spinning him spiraling back, his arms brushing against the hard rocky ground as he came down. He looked up just in time to see that the plant was not a plant at all, but actually some sort of four-legged creature. with the plant on its back and another creature he had never seen before. He thought to himself. He was beginning to think that this island might be full of new animals, new creatures to study. And really, what an amazing opportunity. That is, if he could live through this all. He struggled to his feet, glad his flimsy sandals had not broken the fall. He continued onwards, following the direction of the strange creature that had fled in. There was really only one direction to go, and as he continued on, he noticed the walls of the canyons began to look more and more crumbled and collapsed, as if something huge had come down close to this area and disrupted the landscapes that the nature had spent hundreds of years crafting. And the further he went, the more severe the damage had looked. He could tell
licensing reimagined.
that he was getting closer and closer to something big. And then he stepped dead and looked up, mouth open, at what he just found. It appeared to be some sort of meteor or asteroid at first glance. And its size was, well, he couldn't see the end of it.
Artlist.io.
So it must have been a rock or a truly Protoganian proportions of massive extent. Part of it had sunk into a crater that
Music
is a
licensing
must-have
reimagined.
made upon its impact. Eager to see more, he, cautious, ventured closer to the big, dark gray stone, carefully climbing down into the crater, but not making sure he would be able to climb back out.
Artlist.io.
As he reached the bottom, he had noticed that there was something very peculiar about this meteor. It didn't feel like any rock he had ever touched before. It was almost metallic.
Music
The
licensing reimagined.
He moved alongside, wondering if he could perhaps find a small piece of it he had broken off to take for study later. I mean, this was a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. When he noticed at one point that the meteor had a large hole in it,
Artlist.io.
large enough for him to walk through, standing completely upright. He gave the edges of the hole an exploratory touch, realizing that this was no crudely hacked
Music
hole,
licensing reimagined.
but it was clearly crafted with some smooth edges, almost like a doorway. Cautiously, having completely taken control a long time ago, he climbed into this meteor, expecting it to be pretty dark inside. But instead, he discovered small crystals embedded along the sides, which seemed to be active, a gentle clear light within themselves as he came close to each one. The thing was seeming less like a meteor and more like a fortress of some kind. Or maybe even a spaceship. Part of him was scared to death. Whatever lived in this thing could still be here. And it might not be very friendly. But his greatest strength and his biggest downfall were both the same. His curiosity. And going forward would either be very good or very bad idea. But he could not leave the stone unturned. So he ventured deeper and deeper into this thing. And as he continued to explore down the weird tunnel, he began to notice the doorways on either side, which, like the one he had walked through to get inside, peering through them as he passed by, they looked like large cells of counterparts, all filled with the same sort of lights that were lighting his way, but only different colors. Even more peculiar was the strange carvings that each one had right outside, each room sporting a crudely made picture of different strange creatures. Some look like mammals, some even look like bugs, and some look like plants with feet and hands. He even had to do a double take a few times because he spotted a couple of these carvings that actually resembled the strange creatures he had seen on his way here. He resisted the urge to enter any of them. Finding out where this tunnel was headed, he really had to take priority. As he continued, he noticed the ground began to slope upward. He then approached what seemed to be a huge library full of shelves. But this library was not stocked with books, but rather circular type, almost baseball-shaped objects, all perfectly aligned across these shelves. They all had a particular order in the sense that there was sets of 2 that were usually followed with one of these alien type monster symbol drawings above each one, with each set of 2 having one of these symbol drawings above them. He decided to give one of these baseball-like things a touch. They seemed to have the same metallic feel as the ship. He noticed a button on the end and was afraid what would happen if he pressed the button. He realized at this point that it would be safe to just continue exploring and to worry about these balls later. So he put the ball back on the shelf, and as he stepped back, looking at this vast library-like storage facility, he wondered if maybe these capsules were a way of transportation of these creature-like animals. And also, was this a Noah's Ark type situation. Instead, was it a spaceship transporting two of every species of its planet to Earth? So many theories, yet so many more questions continued to arise. And as he continued, he noticed that the ground began to slope upward. He kept walking and decided to at a little bit more of a slower pace. His legs burned with the effort of walking at an incline until finally it came to a stop. After what felt like forever, and it all ended at one final doorway. The frame of this one completely lined with those light crystals, all of them giving them some sort of violet light. There was what looked like the sunlight stream in from inside. He then held his breath and stepped inside. Bright light flashed on from the ceiling and immediately illuminated the area for him. The sunlight appeared to be coming from a hole that had been punching through the whole of whatever this thing was. Judging from the way the rock seemed to be pushing outward in that area, he decided that the hole had to have been made from inside the room. In the light that poured in from without helped the light crystals already there and illuminating this entire place. Upon the ceiling, flashing into the brilliance, thanks to the light on all four sides of it, was a carving much like the ones that he had seen outside the other rooms. Only this one had almost a sort of sheen to it. The light reflected off the carving and making it look more grandiose than the others. He studied it closely. It looked like some sort of two-legged creature with small arms, big round eyes, a short body, and a long tail. And in fact, it looked a lot like... Suddenly, he gasped in realization that this was the creature he had seen at his school the day of the explosion, the one that escaped. "I found you," he said out loud to the drawing punch of the wall with his fist in excitement. He let out a frightening yelp, jumping back when the wall had shifted underneath his hand in the response. Before his eyes, the wall opened up and a small drawer-like thing slid out. Nestled within were two gray, spherical, ball-like devices, just like earlier before, each one with a sort of knob or dial on the top. The design almost reminded him of some type of egg, since they were obviously meant to hold or contain something. But they were open and they were empty. The coldness of his curiosity ran up his spine, as then he heard a sound.